Good evening. The major headlines of this day are these. Libya said Americans there will not be harmed. West Germany said no to sanctions against Libya. The unemployment rate went below 7% for the first time in 5 years. And stock prices on Wall Street dropped 39 points, the biggest one-day dive in history. The details are in the news summary coming up. Robin?
After the news summary, we focus on the new Libyan sanctions. Assistant Secretary of State Richard Murphy on U.S. terrorist evidence, with reaction from the British ambassador and Libya analyst Joseph CHURBA. Then part 2 of Charles Krause's special documentary series on the U.S. military and Latin America, tonight training their soldiers. Finally, a Wall Street analyst on today's victory of Polaroid over Kodak in instant photography.
Funding for the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour is provided by AT&T. Whether it's telephones, information systems, long-distance services, or computers, AT&T. Funding also is provided by this station and other public television stations, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
The world was full of reaction today to President Reagan's new words and sanctions against Libya. The Libyan government said Mr. Reagan's order to U.S. citizens to leave Libya and other steps announced last night were tantamount to a declaration of war. But a government spokesman said the Americans will be safe and helped in their departure. White House spokesman Larry Speakes followed up on Mr. Reagan's words with a few of his own about what the U.S. would do in the future.
I can assure you that if Gaddafi strikes again and Americans are involved, the United States will be prepared to hunt down and to take drastic action against those responsible for it. But you said if we can find them, we'll get them.
Mr. Reagan late today signed an order freezing all Libyan government assets at U.S. banks. There was no word on the total amount involved. The State Department today also issued a white paper on what Gaddafi has been up to since he took over 16 years ago. The 7-page document accuses Gaddafi of promoting subversion and/or terrorism in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, and the United States. Robin?
America's European allies were virtually unanimous in rejecting President Reagan's call for sanctions on Libya, while Britain and several other nations said they believed trade restrictions were not the most effective way to combat terrorism. West Germany, Italy, Spain, and Portugal flatly rejected sanctions. In Washington, the president sounded a note of understanding for the problem confronting the European allies.
You have to remember that several of those countries have not had anything near the economic recovery that we have had. And they're lagging far behind. They already have excessive unemployment. They're still trying to get back on their feet. In the same period of 3 years in which we have created almost 9 million new jobs, there are some of those trading partners of ours that have not created a single new job in the last 10 years. So obviously they're torn between these two problems. At the same time, I would hope that we could persuade them that we're talking about something of short duration, that if we could all stand together in a thing of this kind, we might once and for all bring back into the fold of civilized countries these outlaws that are perpetrating the terrorist deeds.
A Soviet Foreign Ministry spokesman pledged all-out support for Libya against what he called crude imperialistic pressure from the United States. This afternoon, a group of ambassadors from Arab countries went to the State Department to express their government's reactions and hear U.S. explanations. That's our summary of the news. Coming up, Assistant Secretary of State Richard Murphy, British Ambassador Sir Oliver Wright, and security analyst Joseph CHURBA on reaction to the Libyan sanctions. Then part 2 of Charles Krause's special documentary series on the U.S. military in Latin America. And a Wall Street analyst looks at Polaroid's victory over Kodak. First, we turn to Libya and reaction to President Reagan's announcement of new sanctions. As the President promised last night, the State Department today issued a 17-page white paper documenting what it described as links between Libya and international terrorism. Its title, Libya Under Gaddafi, A Pattern of Aggression. With us now to detail these accusations is Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs, Richard Murphy. Mr. Secretary, is there anything new in this report, anything we did not already know about Gaddafi?
I think that it is a compilation of a variety of items you have heard about over the years, but it is for the first time put together a study of Gaddafi's activities in terrorism in the various geographic regions of the world in a form for the public which I don't think has ever been done before.
Mm-hmm. Would this document constitute the concrete proof that for instance, some of the allies in Europe, Austria, for example, said yesterday was lacking to link Libya with specific events, for instance, the December 27th attacks in Vienna and Rome?
That document does cite as one very strong piece of evidence that the passports carried in the Vienna and Rome incidents were those confiscated by Libyan authorities from Tunisians working in Libya last summer. They turned up in the hands of Abu Nidal representatives in Vienna and Rome just after Christmas. I think that's pretty good circumstantial evidence.
But that had been published before, that fact.
And
yet people like the Austrians, whose own airport was attacked, were saying, their foreign minister was saying as late as yesterday that they didn't see conclusive proof linking Libya with the attack.
I think that we will have the opportunity in discussions with our friends and allies over the coming weeks to lay out in even more detail, the circumstances concerning the Abu Nidal organization, its links with the regime of Colonel Gaddafi. We think they are conclusive, and we hope they will be persuasive.
Mm-hmm. Should this document in itself persuade the Allies?
I think it lays a good foundation for that. That was the intention.
Were you implying a moment ago that the State Department will be able to give Allied nations more detail in private that it cannot publish publicly?
That's correct.
I see. Why can't you publish it publicly?
Well, basically because of the nature of the sources and the intelligence sources that we use to acquire the information.
Many of the incidents outlined in the White Paper are Libya's previous attacks or alleged attacks against Libyans living abroad. What do you think is Gaddafi's principal motive now?
I think that as you track the movements of the Abu Nidal organization from originally in Iraq to Damascus and now on to Libya, you've seen an expansion of that organization's efforts which have dovetailed with Colonel Gaddafi's efforts now, being used by Colonel Gaddafi as he is using Gaddafi. It's a mutual benefit society, if you will, to work against, in the region, moderate Arab regimes, to work against Libyan dissidents wherever they may be found in Europe, in the United States, as was the case of last summer. You have a fairly broad focus where that organization and the Libyan regime have linked up on activities on truly a worldwide basis.
Let's turn to the Americans in Libya for a moment. Their foreign minister said today they would all be safe and unharmed. How safe do you think they are?
We hope the foreign minister meant exactly what he said. We're putting full responsibility on the Libyan regime for their safety.
What punishment are Americans liable to, what was the president referring to last night, if they disobey the order to leave Libya?
There will be criminal penalties amounting to some prison terms and some financial penalties as well if they continue trading in commerce, in investment, in extending loans or credit to Libya after the cutoff date on the 1st of February.
Because they violated a presidential executive order, is that?
That's correct, in which he invoked his powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act.
How long could somebody go to jail for disobeying this?
I believe it's up to 10 years.
Uh-huh. How long have they got, these Americans there to leave? The President said leave immediately. What kind of grace period do they have to get out?
I don't think there's been any set period for that, but I think he put it in the strongest possible terms when he said immediately.
What if it involves the Americans in economic loss or financial hardship? Does the United States compensate them for this?
I cannot answer that directly. I think the purpose of the act, the action of last night, which was taken on the basis of a series of acts over the last several years. Our first sanctions date back over 7 years ago. This was to put the final comprehensive sanction on trade and commerce with Libya in place. Now, a question of compensation to American citizens, I think the basic message the President was giving us last night was that we will not, as Americans, as a government, continue to deal with the regime of Colonel Gaddafi.
So each individual would have to absorb any financial losses himself. Is that what you're saying?
Sir.
I see. Thank you. Jim?
European reaction to the U.S. call for sanctions against Libya has been much, much less than enthusiastic. West Germany officially said no today, and the early signs from Spain, Italy, and Portugal were equally negative. In London, the U.S. ambassador paid a call on the British Foreign Secretary to sample British reaction, as we do ourselves now with the British ambassador to the United States, Sir Oliver Wright. First, Mr. Ambassador, is the evidence of Libya's role in the airport attacks convincing to Britain?
We haven't had a chance yet to study the white paper. We've had a copy, but I have no doubt at all that a lot of this evidence will be proved to be convincing.
Then what then is Britain's answer to the U.S. call to join us, please, in the sanctions?
Well, you know, we've been through this before ourselves. Way back in April 1984, we had a problem with the Libyan embassy then, the Libyan People's Bureau in London, where a gunman from inside the Libyan embassy shot an English policewoman outside in St. James's Square. So this isn't a new problem to us. And we took action then. The action we took was, one, to cut off diplomatic relations with the Libyan authorities and expel all Libyan officials in London and indeed in the United Kingdom. We stopped any supply of armaments of whatever sort to Libya. We cancelled government-supported credit, Export Credit Guarantee Department, credit to trading with Libya, and we set very strict restrictions on private Libyans, like students, for example, coming to the United Kingdom. So we've been through this before, and we are very sympathetic indeed and understand the sense of outrage that the United States feels.
But will there be any further steps taken by Great Britain?
I'm not certain about that. As you said in the news, that Ambassador Price has only this afternoon been to see the Foreign Secretary. We shall have to take very careful consideration of what he says. But after the meeting, the Foreign Secretary did say, and you will have noted from what the President said earlier, we will do our level best not to undercut American sanctions.
Why is there a reluctance, apparent reluctance, to say immediately, yes, Great Britain will join in these sanction moves?
Well, I'm afraid it is sad experience of economic sanctions. I don't know a single example in recorded history where economic sanctions have actually succeeded in achieving the object that you set out to achieve. What our objective must be, it seems to me, is first, if at all possible, to stop these thugs getting into our airports and doing the things they do. And secondly, if we fail to stop them doing what they do, to catch them before they can get away. And our tendency in Britain is to believe that that should be the main emphasis of both our national action, and we see a great responsibility for national action there, but also the main responsibility for international action.
A U.S. Congressman, Congressman Lantos from California, was quoted today as saying that what Europe does on this sanction issue will be a test of Europe's resolve against terrorism. Is that a fair characterization?
I don't think so, myself. With all respect to Congressman Lantos, who's a good friend of mine, I don't think in a complicated situation like this, we would accept that there are criteria that you lay down which will characterize your determination to counteract this terrorism. I would prefer such criteria as the safety of airports. What is the record of Heathrow, Gatwick, Manchester in preventing people like that harming innocent travelers? What is the record of your government in actually sharing information with other governments in trying to combat this international terrorism? Because remember, we are very much having our attention focused this moment on Libya, but that is not the only form of terrorism there is in the world. Practically every country has, well, a great number of countries also have their own terrorist problems, and it is to that that we must address ourselves. And indeed in Europe, I can only speak for the United Kingdom, but indeed in Europe we have the European Convention on the Suppression of Terrorism. All the West European nations have signed this convention, and they undertake, among other things, to collaborate very closely with each other in exchange of information and so on to try and root out this menace from our midst.
Mr. Secretary, is what we've heard from Ambassador Wright a statement of support of the U.S. position toward Libya?
I think it's a very carefully presented statement by the ambassador that we do take as a statement of support. He has rightly cautioned us not to look only at economic sanctions.
He says they don't work, Mr. Secretary.
They have not worked in the past because I don't think there's been sufficient motivation in the international community to make them work. We hope that we are dealing, in the case of this rogue elephant, in the case of Colonel Gaddafi and of Abu Nidal, with forces which will be more broadly recognized as inimical to law and order internationally.
Why not try this time to make them work, Mr. Ambassador? Do you think it's fruitless exercise?
Well, one can only go by experience, and whether it was before World War II in our sanctions in connection with Ethiopia, we have had this very close to home too over the question of Rhodesia. When Ian Smith in 1965 went into rebellion against the Crown, we called upon the rest of the world. We undertook sanctions ourselves against Rhodesia and tried to persuade the rest of the world to conduct them as well. The plain fact is that although Rhodesia was a landlocked country, and therefore one would have thought that had there been sufficient international collaboration, it would have been possible. It turned out that it was not possible. And indeed, sad to say that at the end of 15 years, when the Rhodesian rebellion ultimately came to an end, Rhodesia was industrially better off than it was in the first place. Ultimately, Rhodesia rebellion was brought to an end by guerrilla warfare.
Mr. Secretary?
We think that the measures that the President called for last night will result in some short-term dislocation to the Libyan economy. Now, that dislocation, that pain can be prolonged by cooperation from our friends, from our allies, on a broad basis. There's just no questioning that in our mind. It will be very difficult to work out. The profit motive is very strong.
Do you agree with Congressman Lantos, who I quoted a moment ago, that this is a test of Europe's resolve to do something about terrorism? Is it that serious a matter to the United States government?
It is a very serious matter to the United States government.
Thank you. Robin?
We have further reaction now from Joseph CHURBA, editor of the monthly newsletter Focus on Libya and president of a private consulting group called PEMCON. He was a senior defense and foreign policy advisor during President Reagan's first term, and for 4 years the Pentagon's senior intelligence evaluator for the Middle East. Mr. CHURBA, on this program last week you said the president had to get tougher with Libya. Has he been tough enough?
Absolutely. I applaud his reaction, his first major serious step in isolating economically Libya and in setting notice on the Libyans that it's not going to be a cost-free affair. I further understand that there will be other measures if these measures do not have the desired effect.
What could they be?
Well, that's a matter of speculation at this point.
But you're a very well-informed person. Let's speculate a moment.
To begin with, I don't believe that the economic weapon, so to speak, is limited. The reason for West European passivity in this instance lies in the fact that there are $16 billion worth of developmental contracts that they have with Libya. There are over 300 European firms active commercially in Libya. 70% of Libya's imports come from Western Europe, where 54% of Libyan oil and exports go to Europe. So this imbalance is perceived by Colonel Gaddafi as heavily in the European favor, and because of this, he anticipates that the Europeans would roll over and ignore the American demand for cooperation. He may well be right, because the Europeans do not have the guts, the stamina, the will, the determination to resist worldwide terrorism. So far, we've seen their commercial interest as being paramount and primary. Now, the American president has finally taken the first step, and he has acquired the moral leverage that he needed with which to face the European societies, the parliamentary democracies, and insist that it is in their larger, broader national security interest to cooperate with the United States in putting an end to this renegade regime. It's not going to be done by economics alone. This is only one half of the equation.
What's the other half?
There are political exiles, very active, in Egypt and in Western Europe, who can form a constructive alternative to the Gaddafi regime. These political exiles have the will, they have the intelligence, the arms, the men for replacing Mr. Gaddafi, and in my judgment, they should be supported by the United States politically and diplomatically. I think there is room for fundamental change in Libya, and when that happens, then we need not worry about our airports.
Are you saying that you believe the Reagan administration has in the back of its mind getting actively into the business of replacing Gaddafi?
Well, we have evidence over the past few months. I think it was revealed that this administration finally has decided to isolate and to undermine the regime of Colonel Gaddafi. I don't think that it is a great secret to Gaddafi himself that this is so. The only question is, by what means? And the point is, and it's a very sharp point and very much to the discussion here, that it is not for the United States to replace that regime. The primary responsibility for the recovery of freedom and liberty in Libya belongs to the Libyan people themselves. We can't create that kind of strategic and political environment that would encourage these very heroic individuals to take power in Libya.
How do you think Gaddafi himself is going to react to these sanctions?
I think very negatively. I think as his domestic base erodes very fast with the clergy, with the businessmen, and with his own military whom he has confined to the barracks, I think as his domestic base disintegrates, he is going to strike out wildly and in desperation with more terrorism abroad. And I think the best fact of his desperation and his vulnerability is in the point that he has systematically sought out his political exiles for assassination in Germany and London and other places where they are residing, particularly in Egypt. So Mr. Gaddafi understands his vulnerability, and he is going to seek to eliminate his political opposition. I think he's going to escalate terrorism even in the United States.
Well, thank you. Jim?
You expect that to happen too, Mr. Secretary? The escalation of the violence from Gaddafi, both here and in other parts of the world?
No, I don't think that's a given. I think that is a possibility. I think it's also possible that as we raise the costs, as we increase his isolation, as we, in effect, keep him off balance and really put him in the position of pariah from the international community, he just might get more cautious. I don't think it's a given that the violence will escalate, but it is certainly a possibility. I can't deny it.
Mr. Ambassador, you heard what Mr. CHURBA had to say about guts and stamina against terrorism and $16 billion and 300 firms in Europe. What is that the fact?
I heard what he said. I disagree with him, but I will defend to the death his right to give his opinions.
Okay, but I will defend your right to disagree with him and tell us where he's wrong.
I think what we're really arguing about is not whether there is terrorism and whether it must be combated, but how we do it. And I have already suggested to you some of the ways in which we must do these things and how we can combat terrorism more effectively. I would be much more concerned with, to begin with, we are all democracies, and we must uphold the rule of law. And that is certainly the base point from as far as my government is concerned. This sometimes, in other forms of terrorism, ties your hands behind your back. All right, but you do not promote the cause of freedom and democracy if you disobey the law.
Meaning, Mr. CHURBA's suggestion that the United States should try to overthrow Gaddafi?
I did not suggest that.
No, but I mean the suggestion that that's in the wind or in the works.
Yes. My suggestion was we should create the kind of political and strategic environment that would allow the Libyans to do the job.
Exactly. I misquoted you. You were saying that it was no secret that the United States was attempting to do that.
Undermine the region.
Right. Okay.
Whatever.
Okay, go ahead.
Whatever Libyans do is up to Libyans, and I would not choose to follow Mr. CHURBA along that line. What I do think we can do, and perhaps improve, is to prevent what happened at the airports from happening again. Improve security at airports, improve communication between governments of information on these terrorist actions and so on. It has been very effective. We have you can have also, for example, extradition treaties between governments, and if some terrorists happen to hole up in other countries, they will be returned for a fair trial in the place where their terrorism was. I'm thinking of, for example, of a supplemental treaty which we have just signed between Britain and the United States, which is waiting for the advice and consent of the Senate.
Gentlemen, let me ask all three of you, beginning with you, Mr. Secretary. It's been suggested in the last several days, it was suggested on this program, in fact, last week, that all of this attention and concern and sanctions and threats against Gaddafi is actually playing right into his hands, that he couldn't be happier over this because it has caused him to be right on stage center of the world political scene right now. How do you feel about that kind of talk?
I think it has puffed him up far beyond his real worth and his real weight in the North African scene, in the Arab world, and the regional picture. It's a little hard to avoid that when such dramatic incidents happen, the murders in Vienna and Rome, and he is a very flamboyant, very charismatic figure, to avoid having the focus in on him personally. What I said earlier was I think there's a possibility, at least, that as he senses the pressures growing and the coordination growing that Ambassador Wright referred to, that he just may end up being tamed and drawn away from some of these bloody practices.
Didn't you meet? You met today with the representatives of several Arab countries. Does that concern you? How the Arab world seems to be rallying around Libya in this?
It doesn't concern me in the sense that I understand the initial reaction is always going to be, he's an Arab, he's a cousin, he's a member of the family. That doesn't mean they stand up and say they respect him or they follow him or they admire him or they'll cooperate with him. So many of them have suffered from him, from his efforts against their regimes, be it Tunis or Cairo or Sudan, Saudi Arabia. They've all been the focus of his efforts to subvert their governments over the years.
What did they tell you today? They tell you to cool it?
No, they asked a couple of questions. They asked whether we considered ourselves in a state of war today with Libya. I said no, we did not. And then they asked, well, how can we in the Arab world cooperate with the United States on the Palestinian issue? And they discussed that as a root cause of much of the problems that gives rise to activities such as Abu Nidal.
Did they say to you that if the United States continues this course against Libya, that we should count on the Arab world being on his side against us as a solid group?
No, they didn't say that, and I don't think that's a reality in the Arab world. But as I say, there's a certain mystique about Arab unity, and that the initial reaction is always going to be he's a member of the family, as many difficulties as we have with him.
In a word, Mr. CHURBA, is this helping Gaddafi more than it's hurting him as we speak?
I believe up until last night he had obtained the political and propaganda advantage. Since last night he is now more desperate than ever. He should be frightened to death that the United States has finally taken a meaningful, serious step economically to isolate him as a prelude to his political removal by Libyan exiles themselves.
Mr. CHURBA, Mr. Secretary, Mr. Ambassador, thank you all three very much.